Good afternoon and welcome to Chapter 34, Part 2 with Stephen Regoli. I'm Meg Foley, your host for this Code Academy / continuing education virtual experience. I will be monitoring the question and answer, and we'll bring questions as you pose them or at appropriate stopping points to Steve. Steve, as you may know, as you should know, is the Senior Architect Administrator for BBS. He has been involved in the code development in Ohio since 1991 when he came to the Board of Building Standards as the Executive Secretary. Steve knows just about everything you could possibly know about the Ohio Code and then some. He's a great resource for all of us, and he is here to bring you up to speed on Chapter 34 in all its applications in Ohio. Take it away, Steve.
Hey, hello everyone. Hopefully many of you were in the first session we did at 1. We covered a lot of the basics of existing buildings through Chapter 1, the administrative chapter, where a lot of the basic fundamental parts of existing buildings are explained, and then Chapter 2 in the definitions. So we laid out a fairly extensive history and background of where these provisions came from, and also discussed the ramifications of some of the language the legislature developed for existing buildings in the past. Now, just as a piece of information, the existing building provisions that had been in the old BOCA Code, if you remember the BOCA Code, and then became part of the International Building Code, actually began in Ohio. So we have the claim of authorship to the existing building provisions as they had been used from, probably the 70s all the way through to last 2012 edition of the IBC, because the model codes decided to take Chapter 34 out and develop it into a broader existing building code. But because the scope of that document tends to exceed the authority of the rules of the board, the legislature gave the board the right to promulgate. The board decided to keep Chapter 34. We have been Ohioizing and updating provisions, and as Tila Level asked, will we ever put together a Chapter 34 commentary? That's something that's in the process. We've just begun the groundwork to make that happen. So what we're going to do now is build on what we did last session, and although we won't be able to go into extreme details, we will be able to cover some of the topics you'll find in Chapter 34, hopefully give you some extensive, some interesting information, some understanding of the intent, and then we'll probably continue to take questions through the session. Now, Meg, you can go ahead and send my presentation out to everyone.
Your presentation is live.
All right. One of the things I like to start with, and we had good response last time from everyone, was just a quick explanation that in Microsoft Teams, there are 2 types of Teams meetings. One is a Teams meeting which we're not using. The other is a live event. And you'll notice this icon, the chat icon, you'll find it on your screen, either to the upper right or on a little bar that appears. That's how you will ask questions. Meg will monitor those questions. She'll introduce those at points along the time we spend together. And then at the end, if we have additional questions and we have some time, we'll go ahead and try to answer everyone's question. So let's start with a quick review. Serious hazards. No more important term to understand when we're talking about existing buildings than serious hazard. And remember, a serious hazard is not my preference. It's not complying with, if it doesn't comply with the current code, it's a serious hazard. A serious hazard is a hazard of certain or probable consequence. That means there'll be an immediate consequence, and I know from experience that that consequence is detrimental, and I will issue an order for that occurrence of a serious hazard, and anywhere in my jurisdiction where I find that same condition occurring, I will issue an adjudication order ordering the remediation of that hazard. So understand serious hazard is fundamental to talking about existing buildings. Now, when we talk about serious hazards, we're going to have images that dance in our heads And we've shown a few of those examples, some of which some of you may felt were a serious hazard, some of you may felt they weren't. And if it's not a serious hazard, but you're still concerned, we indicated that there is a tool you can use as part of the resource packet, both residential and commercial. It's called a notice of requested change. It's a notice of recommended change that says we've identified something that hasn't moved up to the level of a serious hazard. It might in the future. We want to put you on notice that this exists in your building, and we'd recommend you make these changes. And we want to go on record as having noticed and notified you so that you understand the burden is now in your lap to address. Now, many things appear to be a serious hazard. I mean, certain things are pretty obvious. If we know things about that, this may be a serious hazard. Sure looks like it could be. I have no idea what this is. And as an inspector, you probably wouldn't either. We know that there are several feeds into this box, and it doesn't conform depending on where it is, if it's energized, what it's used for. This would probably at least deserve a notice of recommended change. That's why inspectors, your cameras are important, and all this information needs to feed back to the building official so the building official can make a call. You may be walking through a building and notice some pretty severe structural cracks and shifts. It may need some more investigation. Again, photographing some of these things, it may be a serious hazard. It may reflect a condition that's been already addressed. It may not. And ignoring that could put the building department at some level of risk if it was noted, if it was discussed. So documentation, investigation gets to be really important. There are parts of a property that are outside the scope of the building code. Parking lot lighting, for instance, is not something that we regulate. If you notice something, you may still wish to notify the owner of a condition that could be hazardous. This pole could be energized unintentionally and someone could be electrocuted. So there are things that are outside the scope of the code that could be hazardous that we may want to notify someone of, but we don't have the jurisdiction to issue orders. There are things you're going to see in older existing buildings. This, for instance, probably should be, if it was new construction, insulated. You're going to see a lot of water staining, water damage. Depending on the extent of the damage, it could be a serious hazard. It may not be a serious hazard. It may warrant a notice of recommended change. These are the kind of calls the building official is going to have to make every day. And you, as the inspectors, need to inform the building official. It looks like those two vertical framing members are newer than the other framing members. Some work may have been done here for a reason. It may mean additional investigations necessary to make a determination of whether there are serious hazards. There are all kinds of creative tradesmen out there, people that like to play electrician or mechanical contractor or structural contractor. But when we see these things, we need to document them, not ignore them, and in discussion with the building official, determine a course of action. No box, we don't know what voltage this is, we don't know what it's supplying, we don't know what the green wire is, we know what green normally is and where it's going. Just too much information that's unknown, but it may be that an order may be issued, but it may be that there's a notice of recommended change, depending on the information we gather. Now, we want to start talking about some of the specific provisions in Chapter 34, excuse me. And when we're dealing with building materials and systems, there tends to be a little confusion, and we just want to make sure that you understand that existing materials can remain unless they're dangerous, unless they're damaged, unless they cannot function as they were originally designed, and then the owner needs to maintain which may mean a repair or a restoration, but existing materials can remain. Also, when there's new construction, new materials should be used. There are some provisions for used materials. If they meet the requirements for new materials, they're not hazardous. And the building official really gets involved here. Now, there are not many building officials that want to make a call on whether old materials comply with new material requirements, but just understand that they can be used, but there's an approval process, and there has to be a determination by the owner, the design professional, that they meet the requirements from new materials. That's very difficult to do, but it is actually spelled out in 34.1.4. Also, another issue that comes up periodically is the lead paint and asbestos. Now, some old homes and a lot of factories and older buildings will have asbestos in different places. They most likely have lead paint, but those are within the jurisdiction of the Ohio Department of Health and Ohio EPA. So if you run into a lead paint issue, turn that over to the Ohio Department of Health, or find out if your local Department of Health has a lead abatement program. Contractors that do that work must test. They get licensed to dispose of some of those materials. Same thing with OEPA and asbestos. That's not something we enforce. We can notify agencies of that type of work in existing buildings, but do not enforce the provisions of those other agencies. And sometimes that comes up and people don't know where to direct an owner. So just noting this, that for the lead paint, there's a lead paint program at Department of Health, and the asbestos abatement program at OEPA. And I would also want to mention this. This is the only place the International Existing Building Code is referenced. And it is used because there are some provisions in it that allow us to use that code, section 721, to determine the fire resistance rating of existing materials, these archaic and older materials. We can, the designers can use that section to determine a fire resistance rating of assemblies and of materials in existing buildings. And you go to that standard, or that code, to find those provisions, and then you come back. The design professional should, if they want to use existing clay tiles or ceramic tile wall assemblies in older buildings, they can go to 721 and use that section to determine the fire resistance rating of those existing materials. Now, some fundamental provisions for existing buildings. Let's start with talking about additions. This is something that is very typical. Now, the illustration on the right does not usually happen. It's more expensive to build up than it is to build on. So we may very rarely see the condition that's in the picture on the right, but we may often see situations where the condition in the picture on the left happens. And on the residential side, typically we see additions that are structures built adjacent to and added to an existing 1, 2, or 3 family dwelling. So this is what we're talking about in either 113.4 or in 3403 when we're talking about additions. So let's talk about that for a minute. Existing buildings, additions. Both codes require that alterations and renovations in and additions to existing buildings comply with the current code, because that's new work. Those renovations in and additions to have to comply with new construction requirements because it's new work. And in an alteration, those renovations and alterations, the code applies to the extent of the alteration, meaning only the new work has to comply. That may mean, as odd as it sounds, that if I put in a wall section where I've removed one, and that currently that corridor would have to be built as rated, that piece that gets put in would have to be done as a rated assembly, even though all the walls may not have a rating, or of an archaic material that it's hard to determine the rating. And remember, the concept of progressive compliance. Over time, as more and more of that building is altered, more and more it will comply with more modern building codes. Additions, however, have to be made to assure that the existing building with the addition added on aren't less conforming with the code than before the addition. And it gets really tricky when an addition covers an existing required means of egress. That path of travel has to be maintained. Travel distances have to be maintained. So the existing building can exist unaltered, doesn't have to comply with the current code, but that addition and that existing building can't be less conforming with the code than before the addition was added. And that, again, isn't a conflict with progressive compliance. What it is saying that we can't make that existing building less conforming. And all portions of the existing structure, which are unaltered, aren't required to meet the codes of the requirements of the new codes. And again, there's that caveat, unless there is a serious hazard. That's why making that investigation and determination will come up over and over again when we're dealing with existing buildings. Now, an owner has options, and we want to talk about some of those options. When we have an addition, talking about additions, when we have an addition to an existing building, and the options are varied. They can put a legitimate firewall in, and that is a structurally independent 3-4 hour wall that will stand even if the structure on either side collapses. It's a legitimate firewall. We've created a separate building, and we'll deal with that separately. The owner can also just put in fire barriers between the existing building and the addition. Now, if they choose not to put a fire barrier in, there's no separation. When the allowable areas aren't exceeded, that one fire area may have to be treated as a single unit. And remember, this is complicated because of that old definition that was put in law of what a workshop and factory is. So we had to come up with a way of dealing with an addition to any of these types of occupancies, A, B, M, that would allow us to put an addition on and not impact the existing building. So it was done in a very specific way in 3403 for additions, and you'll see in that section some Ohio language that was generated to make sure that our provisions for additions conform to what the legislature did in the law. So what you'll find is a fourth option that says the combined height and area of the building, the existing building, and the addition will be used to determine the construction type of the addition. And the construction type of the addition must be increased to a type that is within Chapter 5 allowable height and area. So I will do something that the model codes have never allowed us to do, and that's mix construction types. But to make the existing building no less hazardous, we will count the height and area of both the addition and the existing building, enter the tables, and find out if the allowable area, we'll find out which construction type that area drives us to. Given that we might have an open area perimeter increase, a sprinkler increase, we'll use those tables to find out what construction type could be built of that size, and then apply that construction type to the addition. Now that's for all the building types except sleeping occupancies. We could put a fire barrier petition to limit the fire area we may put an automatic sprinkler system in the fire area. And if the fire area extends a little bit into the existing building, that fire area must be suppressed. And we would put that sprinkler system in if the addition and the area of the existing building exceeds the Chapter 9 limits, but we will put that fire protection system in the addition. And if the code requires it to be sprinklered throughout, that would be considered a building that was sprinklered throughout, and I can get the increases that the code provides for buildings sprinkled throughout. This is the only way we can comply with both the law and the model code's based code requirements. Now, for those additions, when the height and area of the building and the addition is below the allowable height and area, Chapter 5, but it creates a fire area greater than the limits in Chapter 9, one of the following has to happen. So I don't have to change construction type, but if the area creates a fire area greater than the limits in Chapter 9, I'm either going to have to put a fire barrier in to limit the fire area, or I'm going to have an automatic sprinkler system for the fire area that exceeds Chapter 9 limits. So we're still maintaining a level of safety. We haven't made the existing building less safe. And remember, we're going to have to preserve required exits, travel distances, all that kind of stuff is going to have to be maintained. This is dealing with just construction type and some of the requirements that apply. Now,
Steve,
yes.
quick question here.
Yeah.
From Eric Shaver, who writes 3408.1, if a building is required to comply with Chapters 3 through 13 and 14 through 33, can OBC 3411 be used to meet the accessibility requirements?
Now read that again. I want to make sure I get the right sections.
OBC 34.8, 3408.1. If a building is required to comply with OBC Chapters 3 to 13 and 14 to 33, can the OBC 3411 be used to meet the accessibility requirements?
That's 3408. That's change of occupancy.
Right.
And he said 3408.1.
Right.
Let's see.
Being directed back into the current code.
Well, first, in that section, the first thing you have to do is you're going to have to do an evaluation to determine if it's more hazardous or less hazardous. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's not an automatic. You go to 3412 or some other way of determining whether it's more hazardous. And if it's more hazardous, Chapter 3408, the specific requirements for change of occupancy are going to send you out.
Right.
So there has to be an evaluation done first. And
so then the question is, can 3411 still be used for accessibility? Or would it be the other, be the modern chapters of the code?
Yeah, that's kind of confusing there because it says 3 through 12. Let me think about that. I've not been asked that again. He and I can communicate.
Okay.
Thought.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. Good question. Now, there's also provisions in 3404 and the residential code too that deal with systems, components, and materials. This is the building systems, HVAC, the MEP stuff, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, all of those systems. There are some provisions in the code that allow the same provisions for systems, components, and materials as that allowed for existing buildings. So you're going to come over to the existing building code. And remember, the code applies only to the extent of the alteration. So it depends when we're dealing with alterations to existing systems. I'm going to apply that to the new work. The portions of the existing system which are altered or affected by the alteration are required to meet new code. Now, that means that if I have a heating appliance that cannot handle that increase I may now be required to do something in addition to adding to the mechanical system. Same thing with electrical systems and circuits. Again, to the extent of the alteration, not more hazardous than existed, and if the systems, by meeting the new code for the new work, can be deemed safe and sanitary. Again, it's a judgment call. The building official is going to have to be involved. So repairs and maintenance are only required to be done with conditions of existing approval and the system isn't less safe. So repairs and maintenance are going to be treated a little differently. That's not necessarily an alteration. That's not necessarily extending the system. So depending on the extent of the alteration, maintenance and repairs are going to be dealt with differently. Now, in summary, for what we've talked about so far, I mean, you can't protect people from stupid, but you can help them understand what the code requires when we're dealing with additions, alterations, and repairs to existing buildings. The basic premise is that things that are not modified, not altered, are not required to meet the current code unless there's a serious hazard. Now that's the byword when it comes to additions, alterations, and repairs to existing buildings. Not required to meet the current code. They are required to be maintained. When maintaining those is impossible and new systems have to be installed, that's an alteration. But in any case, when there's a serious hazard, it's required to be remediated, and it can be restored to the previous condition it was in. It doesn't necessarily have to comply. It has to be made safe. Now, let's talk about the complicated one, the change of occupancy. And I don't know how good a job I'll do here, but I want you to understand specific things about change of occupancy, and especially as we have to deal with that almost one of the major changes that happens in existing buildings. It's the most difficult. And a change of occupancy is a change in the purpose or level of activity. We talked about that before. This is a review. A change in the level or purpose of activity in a building. And there can be different types of change of occupancy. There can be a complete change of occupancy. There can be a change of occupancy, which would create a mixed occupancy situation that didn't exist before. And the code makes it clear that a change of occupancy of an existing building or space is permitted without having to meet all the requirements in the code, provided, and this is the evaluation that has to be made, the proposed use is not more hazardous than the existing use, and you need to do an analysis. And again, we recommend or suggest you can use 3412 to do that analysis. You may have an engineer do that analysis. You may have some other professional do an analysis to say, is this occupancy more or less hazardous? And for you building department people, you can read out of the code through its tables and charts what is considered more hazardous. If you go into the height or the area table, for instance, and you see that one occupancy permits less square footage than the different occupancy with the same construction type, you know that that's a more hazardous occupancy. So there are ways of reading out of the building code, ways to determine whether a change to another occupancy is more hazardous than an existing occupancy, and then this provision would require that those increases in risk. And that's what it says. If the proposed use is more hazardous, such buildings shall be made to comply with the requirements of 3 through 12, 11 through 14 with 3412. So the only option you have is I can go into 3412, and that's why doing that analysis is helpful, because you may do all the work you needed to prevent you from go back to 3 through 12, 14. To 30.
Folks, bear with us. We're experiencing a little bit of technical difficulty. Steve should be back online in just a minute. Our program will resume in just a minute. Please bear with us. We're running into some bandwidth issues. You're back, yay.
Did that, when did I get dropped?
You completely froze about a minute ago, and your program is no longer loaded.
Yeah,
And we're broadcasting live right now.
Let me share this for you. Get it?
Yep, got it. Your program is live.
All right, I don't know if we left off here or not, but we'll start here.
Go ahead.
You there?
You are live and broadcasting.
All right. One of the things that is difficult is accessibility provisions, and we're not going to be able to do a deep dive here, but I do want to go through some provisions in the existing building chapter that deals with accessibility, because there are some real issues that come up. It scares people. They don't want to deal with it. And unfortunately, this prevents them from adequately enforcing accessibility provisions. And the federal government realizes that when it comes to existing buildings, there is a level of reasonableness that is different than Chapter 11 for new construction. So I just want to touch some of the highlights so that you have an understanding of how the rules address special conditions that exist in existing buildings. So first, we're talking about accessibility. We have to deal with a change of occupancy. We're not in, that's probably one of the most difficult areas when dealing with accessibility. And the code says there are a couple types of change of occupancies. There's a partial change of occupancy where a portion of the building is changed. And then there is an entire change of occupancy. But I want you to notice these three sections, 3411.6, 7, and 8. They are critical to understanding how to apply accessibility requirements for existing buildings. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Not only a partial change of occupancy, but there's also a complete change of occupancy. And that's where the entire building undergoes a change. And it's going to comply with 3411.4.1 and shall have all of the following features. Once we have an entire change of occupancy, the entire building has changed, even if it's an existing building, there's some things it's going to have. Now, even then, the feds, the accessibility requirements give you some leeway, but just follow this, pay attention here, and I think it'll be helpful. First off, if it's a complete change of occupancy, then the building has to have several features. One is at least one accessible building entrance. Look, they're gutting the building. They should be able to provide one accessible building entrance. This can be complicated if you're in, say, the over the Rhine in Cincinnati, or the German Village, narrow sidewalks, they're stone lintels and threshold. I mean, there are some things, but when you're gutting a building, when you're doing an entire change of occupancy, there is an assumption that you have at least one building entrance. There will be one accessible route from an accessible building entrance to the primary function area. Now, again, we need to remember we talked about primary function. We'll talk about that again a little bit. I've got to be able to get into the building and get through the building to the place in the building that it was built for. Signage. We need to have some signage to indicate paths of travel and features. Where parking is provided, there needs to be some accessible parking. This is one of the few places in Chapter 11 or 3411 where we extend outside the building to some site feature. At least one accessible passenger loading zone when there are passenger loading zones provided. And at least one accessible route connecting the accessible parking, the passenger zone, and the entrance. So there are some site features that kick in when I have a complete change of occupancy for a building. Now, there are, for complete changes of occupancy, some exceptions, and this ripples through all of the accessibility requirements for existing buildings, and you've got to understand this term. We're going to define it in a minute, but I want you to see what is included in this complete change of occupancy, where it is technically infeasible to comply with the new construction standards for any of these requirements, the ones we just listed, for a change of group or occupancy. The above items shall conform to the requirements to the maximum extent feasible. Now that's going to be a discussion between the designer, the owner, and the building official. There is an exception for Type B units, but we won't go into that now. The definition. What is really technically infeasible? And here's how the building code, the accessibility standards define it. And that's an alteration that you really can't do because the existing structural requirements really prohibit you from making the changes you need to make, or there are physical or site constraints that prohibit the modifications of the features that need to bring this into strict compliance with those provisions for that complete change of occupancy. There's also, remember, this definition of primary function, a major activity for which the facility is intended. And I wanted to give you some hints that came out of the accessibility laws. Areas that contain a primary function include service lobby of a bank, dining area of a cafeteria, meeting rooms in a conference center, as well as offices and other work areas in which the activities of public accommodation or private entity using a facility are carried out. Not all of the building will be considered a primary function, and therefore those areas won't require accessible features to be added, such as boiler rooms, mechanical rooms, lounges, janitor's closets. Those aren't areas containing a primary function. Now I have to get access to that primary function from an accessible entrance along an accessible path of travel, but these rooms are not considered areas of primary function, and similar things like that. Now when we do an alteration, they have to comply with the applicable provisions in Chapter 11 of this code unless technically infeasible. And where compliance with this section is technically infeasible, the alteration is going to provide the accessibility to the maximum extent technically feasible. Chapter 11 is kind of a scoping chapter. and if we get sent out to Chapter 11, we're going to use that. But when I alter something, it's an alteration that the new code applies to, and I may have to alter in existing buildings to comply, and there are some exceptions. So it's not a carte blanche requirement. For instance, this toilet room that's highlighted may be technically infeasible to enlarge in size because I've got shafts, stairs, quarter widths are set. So I'm going to adjust that toilet room to the maximum extent feasible, and that's deemed to comply in an existing building. I'll put grab bars in. I may protect the underside of the lavatory with some anti-scalding baffles. The toilet can be adjusted, but I can't enlarge it to get my turning radiuses and things, so I'm going to make it accessible to the maximum extent possible. It may, there's usually a misunderstanding that it isn't deemed accessible because a wheelchair can't get in there. People with disabilities often are blind. They may have a cane or walker. There are other types of disability features that this toilet room can have that make it, to the maximum extent feasible, accessible. When we're dealing with conflicts, oftentimes there are building, plumbing, and other life safety and other codes. For instance, let's say I'm going to try to combine 2 toilet stalls to create an accessible stall, but now my plumbing fixture count's off. Well, that would be technically infeasible because the plumbing code does require a certain number of fixtures for a design occupant load. Now, I can't adjust that as a building official for when it comes to fixture counts, but that's something that's going to have to be worked out between the building official, the designer, and the owner. But those conflicts may prevent that project from complying literally with some of the accessibility requirements. Certain parts of the state, Eastern Ohio, where I grew up, Southern Ohio, where there are sites located on steep terrain, and it's difficult to get the grades and slopes that are needed. Possibly then it could be deemed not feasible, and you want to be careful about those, but you want the design professional, the owner, to explain how those requirements can't feasibly be met. Also, if it impacts the structure, including the floor, those essential components can't be altered. You could deem that requirement to be technically infeasible. And alterations, when I alter space, the altered elements or space, the altered element or space is not required to be on an accessible route unless required by 34.11.7. Now remember, that's one of the sections I told you to remember. When we deal with alterations, that altered element or space isn't required to be on an accessible route unless required by 34.11.7. The accessible means of egress required by 10 are not required to be provided in existing buildings and facilities. The alterations to Type A individually owned dwelling units within an R2 can meet the Type B, they're private residence, they're individually owned like a condo. And Type B dwellings or sleeping units, whoops, I just did something here. Let's see, is this, I'm sorry. The alterations in a building where I'm not replacing 50% or more of the aggregate area of the building, I'm not going to be required to provide those Type B dwelling units in an existing building. So there are some numbers you're going to have to evaluate, and the designer is going to have to provide documentation on when we're altering existing buildings. And those are accessible units that trace their history back to FHA, Fair Housing Amendments guidelines for dwelling units. Now, alterations that do affect an area containing a primary function. So this is that type of alteration to a bank lobby or to offices in an office building, where it affects accessibility to or contains an area of primary function. Now I've got to get to it. And the amenities that are along the way. I've got to provide accessibility in the primary function, access to it, including toilet and drinking fountains and those types of things. But again, the feds realize that that can be very difficult in an existing building. So what I'm going to explain to you now about providing an accessible path of travel to an altered area containing a primary function can you can get relief from, but it's a very specific process that says, in this existing building, I want to do some alterations. It's a small office building. It's been there for 60 years. I want to alter some of the offices. I don't have an accessible entrance. I don't have an accessible route. I don't have accessible amenities. And the code would require those to be added. But the feds and the accessibility advocates realize that's one of the most difficult times to require accessibility. So there are exceptions to it and a process to use. Let's look at that. The exceptions are when the costs of providing the accessible route are more than 20% of the costs of the alteration affecting the area primary function. So basically, we have to do an evaluation and say, I'm modifying these existing offices, and the accessibility requirements require me to get there, to get into the building and get to those primary function areas. If providing that accessible route exceeds 20% of the cost of the alterations to that primary function, I have an exception, because that's a disproportionately high cost. There's no expectation that I would spend more than 20% of the project, because in all likelihood, an owner may choose not to do the project at all, and now we know that there's even less accessibility to a building that provides public accommodation. So to determine proportionality, when it's disproportional, that's where this section 3411.7.1, and that's why it's important to all the sections that surround it, is that there's certain things I don't have to count. Now these provisions don't apply to windows, hardware, operating controls, electrical outlets, signs. I don't have to deal with any of this if that's all I'm doing. And it doesn't apply to alterations solely to the mechanical, the MEP systems, fire protection. That's something that I can do, and really there are no accessibility requirements that get triggered. And it doesn't apply to alterations to increase accessibility to an existing building. Let's say I want to just provide an accessible entrance. I don't have to get involved in all this. If I'm making the building more accessible, that's an acceptable alteration, and I don't have to go any further in the building. Now it does not, and again, there's a type B exception. Now the disproportionate cost and the alternative compliance, there are requirements that alterations made to provide the accessible path of travel to the alternate area will be disproportionate to the overall cost, and there's that 20% cost again. And here's the key to this section in 3411.7.1. The determination of disproportionate cost shall be made and applied in accordance with the following. So I'm going to alter some space in a building. that is a primary function. 3411 says you've got to also then make an accessible entrance, an accessible route to that primary function, and you have to make the amenities, the toilet rooms, the phones, all that accessible, the drinking fountains along the way. Now, the codes understand that that can be a very difficult thing to do, and it could be very expensive to make those alterations to that accessible route. So if you want to declare something a disproportionate cost, meaning I can't do all that, it would cost too much, more than 20% of the work I'm doing, so I'm just not going to do the project. So the model codes and the accessibility requirements say that when you say something is disproportionate, here's how you're going to apply that requirement. The costs that will be counted as expenditures required to provide an accessible path of travel include these things: the cost associated with providing an accessible entrance and an accessible route to the altered area, for example, widening doorways, installing ramps, making restrooms accessible, like grab bars, toilet stalls, insulating pipes, the cost associated with providing telephones, amplification devices, costs with relocating inaccessible fountains. I'm going to add that cost up, and I'm going to say, is that amount more than 20% of the cost of creating the alterations in the primary function? And
Steve,
if it is,
we have a related question on that.
Yeah.
The question is, in the definition of technical infeasibility, I have never read the violation of another portion of the code as being a reason to determine technical infeasibility, such as the plumbing fixture count. Am I correctly understanding that this is a factor of consideration? Your suggestion appears to reflect on the old technical infeasibility definition in the ADA.
Yes, what we have in our building code and in the ANSI 117.1, I believe, is that providing accessibility, they don't want it to conflict with other requirements that are spelled out in other codes or standards. And again, we could have some discussion about that afterwards, but that's my understanding of the intent of that section, and that in existing buildings, we don't want the thing to have less of those health and safety features and trade that off against an accessibility requirement for losing a toilet stall versus providing one from those two. And I think that comes from the Access Board. I think I got some of that information from the US Access Board. We'll talk about that though. Once we establish disproportionate cost, the cost of getting the accessible entrance installed and then all the features I need back to my primary function, if the cost of doing that is more than 20% of the cost of the alterations to the primary function, it's declared disproportionate. And in the case of a disproportionate cost, to make the path of travel fully accessible, then I have to do something different. I'm going to make it accessible to the extent that it can be made accessible without exceeding that 20%. And the code even gives you some explanation in choosing which elements do it in this order. And so it's going to tell us if you have 20% of those dollars to spend, then spend them in this order. First, get me into the building. I want an accessible entrance, and then when I have dollars left over, provide an accessible route to the altered area. If there is dollars left over, at least one accessible restroom for each sex or single unisex restroom, to the extent possible. If there are dollars left over, then we're talking about accessible telephones, drinking fountains. But you'll notice that the alterations to an accessible restroom is third on the list. The idea is that I have an accessible entrance as primary importance, and then the accessible route to the altered area. And if I'm spending more than 20%, put the accessible entrance in, and then spend as much as I can, as I have left, on the accessible route. And if there are any dollars left over, then we can apply that to the toilet rooms. That may mean it could only be grab bars, protection of the piping under the lavatories, and spend those dollars that way, so that it isn't disproportional. You'll still be able to go ahead and do the alteration to the primary function, but recognizing that in an existing building, it's very difficult to make these changes. So the code gives you a hierarchy, helps you determine how to develop the cost, how to evaluate the 20%, what can apply to the 20% and what can't, and then an explanation of how to spend the dollars. Any questions so far, Meg?
Reading through, yeah, I have published several questions. The one that just came in was, can an applicant break a project into several smaller projects to get around the 20%? And I don't think so, because it would still be 20% of each of those projects.
There is actually a provision, and I didn't ask you to ask me that question, but there's actually a provision that says the obligation to provide an accessible path of travel may not be evaded by performing a series of small alterations to the area served by a single path of travel if those alterations could have been performed in a single undertaking. And additionally, it says, if I'm altering an area primary function and I do more changes within 3 years of the original alteration, now I've complicated things a lot, because now I have to include the cost of the alteration, the primary function, for the preceding 3 years to consider whether it's disproportionate. So now I'm going to have a lot bigger number to find out what my 20% is. So you're actually kind of penalized if you try to play those games. So a series of smaller alterations is something really, building departments, your records are going to be very important to track the number of alterations in a building that affect an area of primary function, so that we don't game the system and do a series of smaller alterations, thus making the building less accessible than making it more accessible. Good question. Anything else, Meg? Was that it?
There's another one here that says, can the requirements of section 3412 be conducted by anyone, a building official, or just a design professional?
Actually, that's a good question. There is no requirement in 3412 determining who can do the evaluation. Now, obviously, you're evaluating several points, several factors in a building. You'd want somebody that would be able to do that. And sometimes the motivation for different parties is different, so the building department is going to have to review that determination, but there's no requirement that it be the design professional, the engineer or architect of record. I'm assuming the owner could do it, but whoever does it, in order to use it effectively, they really need to be able to make some of those determinations for the scoring. Another one?
Let me get back to that list. I think a lot of these are, let's see. In a complex or major renovation and change of use, would it be permissible to require the architect score the building with and without the changes in order to determine whether the proposed conversion is less safe.
Well, let's wait till we get to 3412. That's coming up here in just a couple slides because we'll talk about that.
Okay, great.
Because that's how 3412 works. There are two scores you use. So let's wait till we get there. We want to finish talking about alterations. So you can't do a series of smaller alterations to kind of avoid doing things to make the building accessible.
Okay, there was one more that I think is topical here. For an addition onto an existing building but a lower construction class, where does it say the building has to comply with the lower construction type?
Well, you're probably never going to decrease the construction type for an addition. It's going to probably be, unless you put a firewall in where you create two buildings, you may be able to use a different construction type. But generally, you're going to at least do the construction type of what's there because, remember, you're going to compare the height and area of the existing plus the addition. So chances are, if you stay within those tabular areas, you would stay in the tabular area for the same construction type. It's only when the area exceeds what's allowable when you add the existing building and the addition that you would bump up the construction type for the addition so that the height and area, the combined height and area would fit in the allowable areas. So I don't know, I hope I answered that question.
I think that Tom Vanaver can have a conversation with you about that one.
Tommy
All right,
V.
moving on.
Okay.
I'd say let's move on to 3412.
Okay, a couple things before we do that. I want to give you an example of a condition where there's been an alteration, just to reinforce what we talked about. If this space is a primary function area, and I'm making alterations here, then that area requires an accessible path of travel if it is not disproportionate. So to get to my primary function, I have to provide an accessible entrance, an accessible route, and what I'm going to evaluate is what's the cost to provide that accessible entrance and accessible route and any features along the way. I will evaluate the cost of doing the alteration in the primary function, and then I need to spend 20% of that to provide this accessible route. This area back here that's not a primary function area, it's not, an accessible route is not required to get me to that non-primary function area. Only when the circulation path to the altered area is off. So if this accessible route extended back behind that that door, that wall, then I might be able to consider some of the costs there. But this is just an example. This came from the U.S. Access Board. I think it's a good illustration. A restroom project involving alterations to the toilet, grab bars, faucet, controls, and mirror, but not to the other elements in the toilet room, can remain unaltered. So as long as the things that I do, to the extent of the alteration, it has to comply. And this is the Access Board is saying, look, we know there are times when it's difficult to make that toilet room comply. But if you want to make it more accessible and you raise the toilet, you add grab bars, you change the mirror, and you change the controls on the lab, all of those things will be done to increase accessibility. The scope of work would be just those things, and if those things comply, that alteration is acceptable. Now the scope, when we talk about alterations, just realize, like exceptions to the general requirements, there are some scoping provisions for specific parts of an existing building when they're used. Entrances, elevators, jury boxes and witness stands, dressing rooms, fuel dispensers, thresholds. Those things have specific requirements that are scoping provisions. Don't ignore those. That's 3411.8.1 through 8.15. So there are 15 items that it speaks directly to when we're doing alterations. If I'm going to put that entrance in, I'm going to look at that section on the accessible entrance. If I've got a toilet room, I'm going to look at those provisions for the toilet room when I put them in, understanding that there's a trade-off between the extent of the work, as I just showed in the slide, and some specific requirements as we've explained it. And then there's 3412, and this is intimidating for a lot of people. I know there are a few architects and engineers that use it and use it well. 3412 provides us with two things. It provides us something that's totally alternative to using 3401 through 3411, and is an alternative to using chapter 2 through 33. It is an evaluation method that I can use for any building, and I want you to understand that these requirements in 34 only apply to buildings built before 1979. And there's a reason for that break. Now, I can use 3412 to evaluate any building to determine whether the occupancy is safe the way I want to use it as an evaluation method. But if I want to use it as an alternative method to analyze a building, I can only use it in buildings that were built before 1979. And as I said, there's a reason. In 1979, we began using, in Ohio, the BOCA Basic Model Building Code as the basis for our code, and we stopped using the Ohio homegrown, home-written building code that had been in place since 1954, I believe. And once we started using more modern building codes, there's a fairly good, consistent product, and the alternative compliance is more applicable to those buildings that were built prior to 79, when it was a local state written code, and we don't want to deprive somebody of the use of their asset. We don't want to require those buildings be raised. So this was developed in Ohio as a way of evaluating an existing building and looked at 19 critical elements. And you comply. There are two scores you develop. There's a building score that you develop for the building that as you propose it, and there's a mandatory score that you develop. And when you take the safety score, that building score that you've developed, when you take that score and subtract the mandatory score, if it's 0 or greater than 0, the building complies. Meaning, I've matched the mandatory score for a building like this, or because it's positive, my building score adds more than the mandatory score, and therefore the building is safe. And it's intended to provide a rational basis for establishing a minimum level of safety as an alternative to complying with the building code for new construction, which isn't fair, since that building, if it's been maintained as it was originally approved, and now we want to make some alterations, I'm going to do an evaluation And if I can show through a rational, reasonable basis that my safety score in this building is at least as good as a mandatory score that the code has, then it's acceptable. And as I said, it's limited to buildings built before July 1, 1979, the effective date of the BOCA-based first Ohio Basic Building Code. And it's a numerical system to comply with the intent of the code as an alternative to complying with all of the provisions in chapters 2 through 33, or in those specific provisions in 3402 through 3411.
Hey, Steve.
Yes.
There's a question from the audience. Why is I-4 exempt from 3412.2?
I'll have to look at that. Here's the thing to be very careful of. You may not be aware of this, and we'll work with you. Our rules, we picked up some fixes that we missed when we updated 3412. So if you call myself or Deb Oler, we can look at the proposed rules. All the proposed rule changes and fixes have been kind of put in limbo because of something the legislature is doing right now. So there may be a fix that explains that particular situation, but we can work with you to help sort that out to make sure that that's what happened, or there may be a reason, and that's why we're trying to put together that chapter 34 commentary, specifically to help with some of the 3412 section question. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's kind of where we are.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Actually, yes. Does not OBC 106 construction documents and the included 106.2 require Chapter 34 analysis submission to the building department to be by a design professional, because that profession is needed as someone who can make code determinations?
Well, let me look at 106. That's an interesting question. You said at 106, what was the rest of it? That's the document section of chapter 1.
Right. Does OBC 106 construction documents 106.2 require Chapter 34 analysis be performed by a design professional? Or does the Chapter 34 analysis need to be performed by someone who can make code determinations?
You know, I don't really see anywhere in 106.2 that even addresses the question. So he's going to have to be more specific on where that seems, where he's.
Okay, I think that maybe that's a question to email in to Steve and Jay, and they can talk about it and formulate an answer. Also, another question, if the design professional quantifies the 20%, would this still require a variance?
No, that's a code provision. I mean, this is
It's
part
not a
of,
variance exactly.
yeah, it's not, it's part of, actually, we pulled that from some ADAG language because it's always been part of the federal accessibility guidelines, but for some reason it was never included in the version that we all have access to. So we pulled it from them and put it in the code so that it was clear that they understood there were situations where you needed to have these options, and that would be acceptable if it was documented, and the building department should make sure that they've correctly and honestly documented the costs.
Okay, and one final question. Does BBS provide a chart or easy method way to apply Chapter 3412 to the existing building project?
No, we don't, and perhaps when we get our commentary together, we'll provide some additional information. That matrix that you use is part of the chapter. That's about the only form that is provided in our rules. That's the form you fill out to document your scores, and that's the form that building departments will do a check on when that gets submitted as part of the project. Good question.
Thank you very much.
So I guess we've already answered the questions, and we're about a quarter after. So unless there are other questions, I'm going to turn this back over to Megan. And you can take it from there, Meg.
Well, thank you all very much for attending and for your close attention to this class. We appreciate you taking part in this brave new experiment of online education, and we look forward to working with you to answer more of your questions as they come up. We are always just a phone call or email away, and we will also have some office hours here starting in about 15 minutes. So with all that being said, thank you for attending. We're done for this afternoon with the required and optional classes. If you need to check out, you can just stop through office hours, take you a second. Thanks, bye.